Over 100 years ago, a university student found himself seated in a train beside a seemingly well-to-do peasant who was saying the rosary and moving the beads in his fingers. Notice that bit. Public witness, not ashamed to show, to wear, and to use. Sir, do you still believe in such outdated things? The student asked the old man. Yes, I do. And you do not? The student burst out laughing and announced, I do not believe in such silly things. Take my advice. Throw the rosary out the window and learn what science has to say about it. Science? I do not understand this science. Perhaps you can explain it to me. The man said humbly, with tears in his eyes. The student saw that the man was deeply moved. In order to avoid hurting the feelings of the man further, he said, Please, give me your address, and I will send some literature to help you. The Catholic man fumbled inside the pocket of his coat and gave the boy his business card. After glancing at the card, the student bowed his head in shame and became silent. On the card, he read, Louis Pasteur, Director of the Institute of Science Research, Paris. Witness. It is not indifferent what one wears and shows. The devil is not absent, it would seem, from the fact that apparently the church is no longer visible in the midst of society. There are still many priests around and many nuns, but who knows it? To be a priest and not to be available as a priest is to be robbing the church and humanity of their rights. Things happen when one is visible. The devil has lost his throne of glory and hates the souls of men who can take those empty spaces. So he does everything to make those means of getting him to glory unavailable. He knows that the direct link is the priesthood. Observe what is happening. In a parish, a local community, an assembly, where the power of grace comes through without obstacle and is not crowded or clouded out by other noises and contamination, things happen. You will have noticed, quite a few of you, that vocations are born in certain types of milieu and are not easily so in others. In this small assembly, I would not be at all surprised if several vocations came forth. Why? Everyone here is responding to grace and to transmitting it and the fullness of teaching. So God is free to act. St. John Bosco, who was also a mystic as well as a great educator, knew that a very high proportion were potentially and embryonically called by God. he had to do only with boys in his situation, and he maintained, divinely illuminated, that 1 in 3 were called. But he knew that it was like nature, very generous, and not every seed took. One day, in Rome, with about 200 other future formators, novice masters and mistresses and so on, we were in front of one of the great lecturers and spiritual directors of Rome, the Dominican what's his name? Father Murray. Doesn't matter. He was talking about the way in which, right now, such screening happens in psychological spheres that the decisive choice of vocation is not necessarily in the hands of the people who have the charism of the Holy Ghost to discern, but of psychologists, psychological screening. It's Paul Murray, of course. And he raised his voice and looked at us, all 200 of us, future novice masters and mistresses, and said, "If you haven't got enough courage to know where you're coming from with your centuries of charism and tradition behind you to have to abdicate before these experts in inverted commas, then you should not be where you are." A clear message. And he was not at all old-fashioned, but on that point he was extremely old-fashioned, because it always worked and still will work when God is free to reign. Now, it doesn't stop there. Discernment of vocation is something not in one go. It is something which is akin to a relationship, accompaniment. And in France, sometimes they talk of l'accompagnement spirituel rather than la direction spirituelle, accompaniment rather than direction. You're a soul friend. Now, I've been around a bit in the monastic life, and I've seen certain patterns emerging. I will go because actually the Church in Ireland has asked us to go by the directives given for this Sunday in preaching into a personal domain. They ask us on this Sunday to give some personal asides, because they're the ones that people listen to. So I want to give 2. The first one is precisely from the angle of novice master, on therefore the orientating end. If one has to do with somebody that Providence has sent, one has to what? Love that soul into being. I repeat, love that soul into being, in such a way that that soul then freely will not disobey, but will open up and be always on side. It was rather sad in a way, the way I had to get that job. It was precisely because it was a French community, and the superiors knew that in France, whereas there a rule is a rule, in Italy, where we were founding, a rule is sort of a rule. And therefore, it's somewhat less painful and more digestible for an Italian to have to do with a Brit than with a Frenchman, who will send him to where he belongs in no uncertain terms. We had a few casualties because of that kind of attitude, so they put a more gentle Brit in the midst. But it was precisely that which actually calmed things down a lot. And the proof is actually, just the other month, we were all together again, except the founding powers coming next month, in Dublin, singing Vespers, as in old times, but in the University Church. And it was very moving, because I was with 3 of those I'd formed, on both sides, an ex-novice of mine, and on the other extreme end, Fer Adriano, we'd admitted in and helped along as he was a postulant. And it was very interesting that all 3 of them, I remember, even though it was totally illegal, always wanted to come to me to confession. And why? Precisely because there was this element of relationship, because if you give them time and attention, they'll come back, because they want to be understood and heard. Now that brings me to the point. I remember all through my monastic life, this was always a problem, except in one case, and I'll come to it in the end. It was this problem of communication and listening. Quite often in my monastic life, I had to do with this brick wall of a problem, physical deafness. We had superiors quite often who had a hearing problem, a hearing aid, and it was very difficult, because what happens there? They put up a barrage to show they can't hear. They start talking, and they're talking at you, and it's a one-way channel of communication, and there's no rapport. I'm exaggerating, but not much. Communication is a thing of the heart under the internal ear. And if it's not there, you can talk about any kind of methodology of recruiting, but there's no meeting going on and no channeling of God's grace, because God can't get through if the dysfunctionality of the relationship is such that he can't use the faculties of the person who's got the charism to direct, because the Holy Ghost is involved. We call it grâce d'état, grace of state. And that's why, by the way, when other people meddle, and that happens too in the monastic life, who haven't got it, and they start correcting, things go wrong. On that level, I'll just give you a little anecdote. A novice master, and the same applies in a seminary or anywhere where there's formation going on, has to correct and form. And of course, the correct way, if there's somebody who has something to correct, they will tell the novice master, correct novice so-and-so on this. And of course, he tries to do so if he thinks it's necessary. Just a little anecdote, because I copped on very early on that you should never end up with the result with a wounded heart. You get the result with joy, and it can be done. The same thing. It's called in Latin, ridendo castigare mores, laughing to correct manners. E.g., I was told to correct a novice one time because it was freezing cold, there was no heating at all in church ever, it was a freezing church, so they would put all kinds of things on to warm up. So we had huge scarlet football socks, you see, under his white habit. And anyway, this is correction, correct these scarlet socks. So anyway, coming to the chapter of faults for the novitiate, you see the prostrating before you with their faults. You notice, yes, we give them some kind of sublime teaching, like we're on earth, or reproducing the life of the angels, the choir of angels of earth. We are the canons and the monks of creation. And by the way, normally angels do not wear scarlet socks, and you got it that way without upsetting anybody. But it's the same result without hurting. Remember that, those who have to correct things at home. Do it without hurting. It's far more effective. But the other is this. With regard to the divine, and here I'm on the receiving end, no human programming can produce a vocation. Either it's there or it's not. What humans do is call it forth and discern it, and also impetrate heaven that it may come, hence Eucharistic adoration. And by the way, there's normally a direct relationship between the amount of adoration going on in an area and the number of vocations. On that point, I just come to, with regard to how the Lord works. He works on two levels, but juxtaposed and intertwined. The first is providential contacts, both human and historic. A person says a word, preaches a word, or hints a word, or one goes to a place where one is fulminated. I remember one time, we were just coming out of the Welsh Mass in Gelliladal, and my spiritual father at that time, because my old one had died, he was a good Irishman who spoke Welsh. He's now since dead. We were in the car after Mass, and he pulled out of his pocket this letter and said to me in Welsh, I've just got this letter from Ireland. What's this all about? So it was a letter from the novice master of Kilmacroft, not far from here. And without saying a thing, he'd written there, and he'd said more or less, I've got a student here who might have a vocation for you, because he didn't want me to go back to the people to enclosure, because it would be more open. And I looked at this letter and I thought, that's strange. I didn't ask for this, but maybe one sometimes abdicates and one listens to the language of providence. So a few days later, this phone call came from the abbot. My mother took it actually, so I answered it, and he said, come to meet me, I'm actually in Wales. And so down I went, and he fixed everything up. Come and we'll sort you out. And the following day after I got there, there was an ordination. Now that was important, brethren was being ordained. And you know what happens there? One can feel the Holy Ghost in the air. In a certain moment, there's a contact between earth and heaven, and grace is passing from the upper room. And you feel it, and you know from that moment on, this man is configured to Christ the High Priest forever, even should it be in hell, should he lose his soul. Now, it hit me as I was just watching this and taking it in prayer in the Abbey Church. That will be you if you just quietly say yes to every proposed grace coming now. The following day, we had the first Mass, and the abbot preached for the newly ordained, and at the end of his homily he came out with this. Because it was a Norbertine house, he quoted St. Norbert, and it went something like this. Priest, what are you? And it went on. I bypass, and it concluded with this. Priest, you are nothing. Priest, you are everything. And that word remained with me till this day. But something else happened a few days later. It was this. The prior, not the abbot, the prior sent me to keep watch, because there was no before the monstrance, the evaluation of the time in Kilmacrot. And there, I mentioned it before, and you can hear it again if you want, that which I recorded here the other day at the elevation. It was watching the host and also realizing it's not that complicated. All one has to do is one thing. Love. Love and console. If one has that, if one has a relationship with him, the rest will follow. And if vocations are crumbling now, even after 2 or 3 years of ordination, it's because that bit is missing, and the devil knows it. Keep them so busy that they lose their interior life and therefore their contact. That's the great way. If there's no relationship, they will not resist, because a human relationship then becomes more important and more immediate. I just finished with one last thing, getting back to where I started. In my monastic journey, and therefore priestly journey, there's one big exception. It was the biggest mistake I made in one place, and actually in Ireland, and it's what brought me back to Ireland. Of all the places I'd seen and been to and lived with, there's one big exception which stands out in my mind. It's Ross Crane. Why? Because in that community there was a huge amount of love, and that only too late did I realise. There's a goodness in Ireland which is there for the taking. It's not the same as the French. They don't do certain things in the same way, but they're more balanced quite often, and it saves many a person from a shipwreck of vocation, because the goodness balances sometimes the harshness, and you need the two. I just finished with this. It was because the French thing was so strong that I couldn't bear to have to talk. You see, the Trappist thing was still there. But after a few months, I couldn't bear the tension anymore, so I came back to my studies eventually to do theology and all the rest of it. But anyway, this, I'll leave it with you, was what I wrote after I said to the abbot that I wasn't able to carry on. And it was something after I said it, I knew I'd made a mistake. And I would say that to anybody who down the line thinks of a vocation. It was said to John Paul II. He was studying for the priesthood, and he felt the call to be a Carmelite. And he mentioned it to his spiritual director, and the spiritual director just said this: you must finish what you have started. What has been started must be finished, and then you'll see. And of course he went on to ordination as a secular priest. But that is always the advice to be given. Never pull out when you're on the track. There'll be time later on, because that's what the devil does. He makes you do all kinds of interesting things to get to a higher level, but you avoid what you've got and you miss it, and then he gets you away from ordination altogether. It's a glorious temptation of the angel of light. If you're en route, get ordained, or get professed. It's a great ploy of the demon to put good temptations in the heart of a generous soul and make a vocation crumble. Now, just to finish, years later, that same monastery was still faithful, and the proof is there were 2 of them at my profession here in Ireland a few years ago. But the abbot, now of course somewhere in his late 80s, he's still faithful. And that same abbot, he was on his knees asking for my benediction after I'd been ordained. That goodness was still there. And he came on the phone one day and I was in tears because of the goodness I had not realized was there when it was there. And I just ask you, if ever you're involved with this vocational thing, sometimes remember, if you have a community or even one important superior who can actually love you into being in the name of Christ, that will get you at least to something which exists, which might not be perfect, because you can't get perfection on this side of the grave, but you can get something. And if you've got the priesthood or profession, you've got access to a timetable which protects you, access to the altar where you meet your God. That's what matters, and the devil knows it. So I just had this out as well, because it was what I wrote after, years later, that same abbot came on the phone and was writing letters to me. Too late have I loved thee.